Most people believe that spiritual awakening is the end of suffering, that it is enough to wake up to the truth, cross that invisible threshold within oneself, and life will organize itself around a luminous purpose. They expect peace, clarity, enthusiasm, a new energy that pushes the body out of bed with renewed joy. But Carl Jung observed something colder, something that almost no one has the courage to admit after crossing that portal. Awakening does not organize your life. It silently dismantles all the structures that supported the previous version of you and leaves you sitting in the middle of the rubble, not knowing why you should continue. What you are feeling right now is not depression. It is not laziness. It is not spiritual failure. It is the natural collapse of a motivational system that ceased to make sense before a new one could be born. And until you understand what really happened, you will keep trying to resuscitate an internal corpse and calling it discipline. There is a specific psychological sequence that almost no one explains about this phenomenon. Before the awakening, your life was driven by invisible layers: the ambition to prove something to someone, the need to be recognized, the fear of being left behind, the comparison with schoolmates, with siblings, with strangers on the internet, the desire to repair an old pain through a future achievement. These layers were the fuel that made you wake up early, train one more time, send one more resume, smile in a meeting, persist in an empty relationship, post a photo waiting for validation to arrive. You called all of this motivation. But Jung understood something darker. Most of what you called motivation was never an internal force. It was a sophisticated escape mechanism, so well wrapped in productivity and purpose-driven discourse that it went decades without being questioned. And when the awakening happens, this mechanism simply stops working, not because you got worse, because the lie that sustained the movement was seen for the first time, and no one can continue believing in something once they have seen the trick behind the curtain. That is why the void arrives so suddenly. You look at the goals you were pursuing 2 years ago and feel a clinical strangeness, as if you were reading someone else's diary. You open the app where you tracked your objectives and do not recognize the urgency you placed there. You receive a compliment that used to fill you for days, and now it slides off your skin without leaving a mark. The people around you interpret this as apathy. Someone suggests therapy. Someone suggests more gym time. Someone suggests you need a new challenge, a new hobby, a trip, a relationship. Everyone pointing in the wrong direction. Everyone trying to fix the symptom without touching the cause. Because the cause is not a lack of external stimulus. The cause is that the internal structure that translated stimulus into movement was silently dismantled. You don't need another reason. You need to understand why the old reasons stopped reaching you. What Jung called the ego is not vanity. It is not pride. It is not that unpleasant character who wants to show off. The ego, in his vocabulary, is the psychological structure that gives you a fixed address within yourself. It is what answers when someone asks who you are. It is the invisible list of adjectives, functions, roles, and narratives that you carry all day long without realizing it. The responsible son, the strong woman, the promising professional, the one who never gives up, the one who always helps, the one who is still going to make it. This list functioned as a map. Every time you had a doubt about where to go, the ego consulted the list and pointed the way. Every time you felt tired, the ego consulted the list and reminded you of the reason. Every time you thought about giving up, the ego consulted the list and recited the identity that would be at risk if you stopped. The ego, therefore, was not the problem. It was the motor. And spiritual awakening, when it is real, does not strengthen this motor. It turns it off. Pay attention to this nuance, because almost no one explains it precisely. The ego does not disappear in the awakening. It only loses the authority it had. Before, it commanded. Now it speaks, and no one obeys anymore. It is as if an authoritarian manager kept shouting orders in an empty room while the employees have already left. You can still hear the old voice telling you to produce, to compare yourself, to prove, to conquer. But the body does not get up. The will does not follow. The impulse does not arrive. And this is not a character flaw. It is the psychological signature of an identity that has already died inside, though it still tries to command from the outside. You haven't lost motivation. You have lost faith in the character who needed that motivation to exist, and no productivity technique, no miracle method, no coach will be able to return that faith because it wasn't taken from you by mistake. It was removed because it was preventing you from being who you truly are. That is why I prepared the Código do Despertar for you. If you are feeling exactly this right now, this silent displacement between what your mind still orders and what your body already refuses to execute, you don't need another dose of artificial motivation. You need an inner map that translates day after day what is being dismantled inside you and what is trying to be born in its place. The Código do Despertar is that map. It consists of 60 days of daily lessons, anchored in the psychology of Carl Jung, with keys, questions, and declarations that accompany you through the crossing of individuation. You read the lesson, perform that day's micro-action, record the reflection in your diary, and allow the process to happen instead of forcing the return of a version of yourself that can no longer come back. The link is in the first pinned comment of this video. If you recognized yourself in what I have described so far, leave a comment with a single word, present. This is your symbolic commitment that you will no longer run away from this process. The illusion that you just need to try harder is ending, and the next step depends entirely on you accepting that now. When this internal structure collapses, something strange begins to happen with time. The days seem longer and shorter at the same time. You open your laptop to work and stare at the screen for 40 minutes without producing a single line. You open a book and read the same sentence 3 times without it sinking in. You sit down to meditate, and the only thing that appears is a tiredness that seems to come from another dimension. The old rituals of discipline no longer work. The catchphrases that used to lift you up now cause you an almost physical discomfort. And the most disconcerting thing is that you are not sad. Not exactly. You are in a psychological place that everyday language does not yet know how to name, a state that Jung would describe as the interval between the death of one identity and the birth of another. It is not depression, it is gestation. But gestation, contrary to what self-help discourses teach, is not a pleasant period. It is a period of thickness, of heavy silence, of functional incompetence for the tasks that require you to continue being who you no longer are. And here appears the first cruel paradox of awakening. The more you try to keep busy to escape this silence, the deeper you sink into it. Because each new attempt to resume the old rhythm is made by a character that no longer exists. It is like an actor trying to perform a role in a play that has been cancelled. He memorizes the lines, puts on the costume, steps onto the stage, but there is no longer an audience. There is no longer a theatre. And the sound of his own voice echoing in an empty room becomes, over time, more unbearable than the initial silence. That is why so many people in the process of awakening fall into cycles of burnout, even when they are doing little. The fatigue does not come from the amount of tasks. It comes from the effort of simulating an identity that no longer sustains the effort. It is the exhaustion of performing a self that is being buried while asking to be resuscitated. And every attempt at resuscitation delays what should be being born underneath. What most people in this state do is the exact opposite of what they need to do. They rush to fill the void, they schedule more appointments, accept more projects, start 3 courses at the same time, throw themselves into a new relationship, travel without purpose, go on an extreme fast, start a radical diet, discover a new sport, drown themselves in new spiritual routines. All of this with the same unconscious goal, not to feel the interval, not to look at the empty hallway between who they were and who they are not yet. And it is here that Jung would be more surgical than any contemporary therapist. He would say that this escape not only delays individuation, it sabotages the chance of it happening. Because the new self cannot be born under the pressure of the old. It needs silence to organize itself. It needs listening. And every time you plug the hole with artificial productivity, you prevent the new form from emerging. You keep giving birth to the same old character, more tired, more disillusioned, more out of alignment with what your soul is trying to say. There is a fundamental difference between clinical apathy and initiatory apathy. Clinical apathy is a closing down. The body gives up, the mind falls ill, the world darkens systemically. Initiatory apathy is an opening up. The body slows down. The mind falls silent. The world loses sharpness so that another layer of reality can appear. You need to learn to distinguish one from the other within yourself, because treating one as if it were the other is the most expensive mistake of this phase. If you are in the initiatory process and insist on treating it as an illness, you silence the very messenger who came to bring you instructions. If you are in a clinical process and romanticize it as if it were initiatory, you fail to seek help that could save your life. The difference is subtle but clear when you pay attention. In clinical apathy, even what you loved hurts. In initiatory apathy, what you loved has simply lost its texture. There is no suffering, there is distance. And this distance is not indifference, it is repositioning. Something inside you is moving places, and until the move is finished, everything that was around that old place appears detached, foreign, as if it belonged to someone else. And it is precisely at this point that the most sophisticated trap of the phase is set. The voice of the ego, even weakened, still has one last card to play. It whispers that if you just try a little harder, just go back to the gym, just resume that list of goals, just force yourself to produce for a week, everything will go back to normal. And because this voice is the most familiar voice in your head, you believe it. You try. You set a schedule. You buy a new planner. You make a plan for the next 90 days. And it works for 3 days, maybe 5, maybe a whole week if you have a large emotional reserve. Then everything collapses again, and this time with a worse taste, because now the feeling of failure is added to the apathy. You begin to accuse yourself internally of lacking discipline, of becoming complacent, of becoming what you always criticized in others. But the problem was never discipline. The problem is that you are asking for discipline from a motivational system that has already been deactivated. It is like demanding that a house without electricity turn on the lights just because you press the switch harder. Strength is not what is missing. The source is what has changed. Here the logic reverses, and this inversion is what most people never understand. You don't need to recover the old motivation. You need to let it die completely. As long as a thread of it remains, the new cannot settle in, because the human psyche cannot support two operating systems running at the same time. One must end for the other to begin. And ending, in Jung's vocabulary, means accepting the void as a legitimate state, not as a phase to be overcome, not as a symptom to be eliminated, as a territory to be inhabited. That is why I prepared the Código do Despertar as a daily guide for this specific crossing. It is not motivation, it is orientation. The link is in the first pinned comment. Do not let another day pass trying to resuscitate what has already died. The decision needs to be today. When you finally stop fighting the void and begin to inhabit it, something very strange and very important happens. It stops being empty. Or rather, it reveals that it was never empty. It was only occupied by layers so silent that the previous agitation prevented you from hearing them. You begin to realize that within that silence there are voices. Not literal voices, but psychic contents that were suffocated under the noise of productivity. Old fears appear that you never had time to look at. Desires appear that you inherited from your parents and never knew were not yours. Swallowed rages from over the decades appear. Ambitions betrayed in the name of family approval. Dreams that were traded for security in adolescence and were never recovered. Masks also appear. The mask of the dedicated professional. The mask of the understanding partner. The mask of the grateful son. The mask of the available friend. All of them begin to peel away from the face, and you realize with almost clinical shock how many hours of your life each day were spent holding these masks in place. The exhaustion you feel after an ordinary meeting, after a 20-minute conversation with a relative, after an entire afternoon of messages at work, is not physical tiredness. It is the exhaustion of performing a version of yourself to keep others comfortable. You weren't working, you were acting, and acting consumes an amount of energy that no physical labor consumes, because every gesture must be calculated, every sentence must be filtered, every expression must be calibrated so as not to expose what is underneath. Awakening is the moment when this performance begins to fail, and the failure, though painful, is the first sign that your truth is stronger than your mask. What you called a crisis is, in fact, your honesty returning to your body after years of exile. And when it returns, it does not ask for permission. It simply displaces everything that was pretending to be in place. Here appears a perception that silently reorganizes your entire life. You begin to distinguish, with almost surgical clarity, what inside you was motivation, based on fear, from what was true will. And you realize that almost everything, absolutely almost everything you called a dream, was fear in disguise. Fear of disappointing, fear of being forgotten, fear of being considered mediocre, fear of dying without having been noticed, fear of not being worth it. And what remains after this fear is recognized as fear is very little, a tiny, almost childlike will to do simple things, caring for a plant, cooking a meal without haste, writing something that no one will read, sitting on a park bench with nowhere to go. And the old ego, at first, despises these impulses. It calls them mediocrity, complacency, loss of ambition. But you begin to notice that these tiny impulses, unlike the old ones, do not empty you after they are executed. They fill you. They give you back something you didn't even know you had lost: presence. The new motivation, when it begins to emerge, hardly looks like motivation. It doesn't come with urgency. It doesn't come with internal applause. It doesn't come with fantasies of recognition. It comes as a quiet curiosity, a serene will to try something small. An inclination to read a specific book without knowing why, an unexpected readiness to call someone without an agenda, a discreet joy while watering a plant or tidying a drawer. And if you, out of old habit, try to turn these gestures into achievements, into content, into measurable productivity, you kill the process, because the previous logic was accumulation. The new logic is resonance. You don't do it because you want to have done it. You do it because in the moment you are doing it, something inside you says yes. And this yes, so silent, is the only reliable compass left after all the others have been dismantled. Learning to listen to it and to trust it, even when it completely contradicts the old list of goals, is what Jung called individuation in progress. The final stage of this transition is not the arrival of a new fixed identity. That is the mistaken expectation that many people carry. They expect that, after the void, a new illuminated version of themselves will emerge ready-made, with a clear new purpose, a new career, a new narrative. But what happens is more subtle and more powerful. The ego does not die to give way to another ego. It only stops commanding to start serving. It remains there, functional, operating the day-to-day, taking care of practical tasks, organizing the schedule, making daily decisions. But it no longer decides the course. It obeys a deeper orientation, a voice that comes from a center that Jung called the self, and which popular language sometimes calls soul, essence, presence. This voice does not speak in quarterly goals. It speaks in coherence. It asks at every fork in the road if what you are about to do is aligned with who you truly are. And when the answer is yes, the movement happens without effort. When the answer is no, no amount of discipline can sustain the effort for long, and what seemed like stagnation is actually the wisdom of the body refusing to collaborate with a wrong direction. What you called a loss of motivation was, in fact, the silent dismissal of the internal manager. He was promoted to a lesser role. He stopped being the owner of the company and became an executor of orders. And the new administration, quieter, more patient, more aligned with your truth, is still learning how to command. That is why the interval seems so disorienting. It is not an absence of direction. It is a change of shift. One force went out, another came in, and you are in the exact minute of this administrative transition within yourself. If you understand this, you stop demanding from yourself a performance that no longer makes sense, and you start collaborating with what is trying to install itself. Motivation has not disappeared. It changed sources, and the new source does not pump adrenaline. It pumps presence. And presence is a fuel that does not accelerate, but sustains. It does not push, but leads. It does not shine, but illuminates the next step with a clarity that no old ambition ever managed to offer. That is why I prepared the Código do Despertar as a specific path for this period of internal transition. 60 days of guided listening, anchored in Jung's psychology, so that you cross this interval without sabotaging it and without getting lost inside it. The link is in the first pinned comment of this video. If you have come this far, it is because something in you already knows that the way back no longer exists. There is only the way inward, and it begins today, or it continues to be postponed for another year of exhaustion disguised as purpose. The decision is yours, and it needs to be made now. When this integration begins to happen, you realize that life doesn't get easier. It gets truer. You still have bills to pay, obligations to fulfill, difficult days, conflicts, tiredness. But the nature of your relationship with all of it changes. You stop fighting against your life as if it were an enemy to be overcome, and you begin to inhabit your life as one inhabits their own home. The tasks continue to exist, but you do not dissolve within them. People continue to exist, but you no longer perform for them. Problems continue to exist, but you no longer identify with them to the point of forgetting who is behind it all. And the strangest thing is that by stopping the forcing, many things that previously required monumental effort begin to happen with a naturalness that is startling. Not because the universe is conspiring, but because your internal system, once aligned, stops wasting energy fighting against itself. And this released energy begins to translate into effective actions, clear decisions, coherent choices. You stop waking up early out of obligation, but you start waking up early because the body naturally organizes itself around a healthier rhythm. You stop training out of fear of aging, and you start moving because the body asks for movement. You stop studying to stand out, and you start studying because curiosity has returned for its own sake. You stop working to prove something, and you start working because there is a vocation being executed. None of this is impressive from the outside. No one writes a headline about someone who started inhabiting their own life again. But on the inside, everything has changed, and it is this silent change, invisible to others but irreversible for you, that Jung called complete individuation. It is not enlightenment. It is not transcendence. It is simply you ceasing to be a character to start being a subject. The silence you crossed was not wasted time. It was the only possible way for the new to install itself without sabotage from the old. The apathy you felt was not an illness. It was the body refusing to continue serving an identity that was no longer yours. The loss of motivation was not a spiritual failure. It was the silent fulfillment of the promise that awakening always carries and that almost no one has the courage to honor. The promise that, if you truly cross over, nothing that moved you before will continue to move you. And that is what, in the end, separates those who truly awaken from those who merely collect decorative spiritual experiences. Those who collect want to go back to normal with a layer of spirituality on top. Those who truly awaken know that normal was exactly what needed to be dismantled. You can close this video now and keep trying to resuscitate a motivational system that has already been turned off inside. You can spend another year accusing yourself of laziness, of complacency, of lack of discipline, when in truth you are only refusing to listen to what your soul has been shouting in silence for months. Or you can accept that the only honest way out is to go through. Not around, not to postpone, to go through. And to go through, you need a guide that translates the process into daily steps, without artificial promises, without cheap mysticism, without magic solutions. You need a map. The Código do Despertar is that map. The link is in the first pinned comment. The illusion that you just need to try harder is ending, and what comes after it depends entirely on what you decide now, in this second, before closing this screen. Choose.